What are the key areas to consider when reviewing your vendor's SOC 2 reports? The first area you should look at is the service auditor's report. It's section 1 in the report. Did they issue an unqualified opinion or a qualified opinion or an adverse opinion or a disclaimer of opinion? Unqualified is the best opinion. Everything was good to go. Qualified means something was bad, but most of it was good. Adverse and disclaimer are saying the audit was pretty bad. The second thing I would look at is a system description. Have they documented their system description, their appropriate controls? Do you agree with their system description? Does it cover the scope of the services you're using them for? The third thing I would look at is the scope of the testing and the results of the auditor's testing in section 4. Do you agree with the controls that they covered? Are there any missing controls that you think they should be covering in their SOC 2 report? Did the auditor call out any exceptions? If the auditor did call out exceptions, are you comfortable with the management's response to those exceptions on how they remediated those exceptions or what they're planning on doing? The final thing I would look at is to make sure it's a type 2 report, make sure the period covered is appropriate for your audit report. It's a recent report. It's not more than 6 months old or 12 months old. And does it cover the scope? Is there certain locations you were looking for? Is there certain services you were looking for? Is there certain products? Once you make sure all that's in place, the report should be good for you to review. How should we collect related SOC 2 reports from our vendors? Well, the easiest way is to reach out and ask them. If they're a smaller vendor, unfortunately, you're probably going to have to reach out to your account representative and ask them for the SOC 2 report. And then you probably have to sign an NDA and go through that process. If they're a big customer, or big vendor like AWS, Azure, GCP, a lot of times they have it available through your login to their portal. For instance, in AWS, it's called AWS Artifact. If you have an account with AWS, they will give you access to AWS Artifact. And then you can download the reports. A lot of smaller companies aren't going to do that, but the bigger ones do. So it can be an arduous process depending on how many vendors you have to look at. What are the differences between the carve-out method and the inclusive method for subservice organizations? The carve-out method means you are carving out the subservice organization from your report. This means the auditor is not going to test the controls as part of your audit. When you use the carve-out method, you just mention in your system description that this subservice organization is being carved out, and these are the criteria that they are helping me meet. So for example, for AWS, you're relying on them for physical security of the servers. They help you meet the physical security criterion. When you use the inclusive method, it means you're including the vendor in your audit. So if you're using a small managed service provider and they are responsible for your outsourced IT and managing your environment, managing your security, chances are you're going to have to include that MSP in your audit because they are a very integral part of your organization. So when you use the inclusive method, the MSP is actually being included and the auditor is asking them for evidence and they are testing controls that the MSP is performing for you. Inclusive method is very rare. It's not used that often, but there are certain cases where it is necessary. How should I handle vendors and subservice organizations I work with in regards to risk management? You should be monitoring your vendors and subservice organizations on at least an annual basis. You need to be looking at the higher risk ones more frequently than the lower risk ones. So the first step you have to do is identify what is the risk this vendor or subservice organization presents to my organization. If they're high risk, you should be asking for their SOC 2 reports. You should be performing additional due diligence every year. You should be monitoring to see if they had any significant breaches. And you should be evaluating risk of using them every single year. If the risk becomes too high, you then have to make a business decision. Do we want to keep using them? Is there another vendor that we can use? Is there a business justification for using another vendor? Is the risk too high from a cybersecurity perspective that we can't keep using this vendor? It creates a lot of additional questions when the risk becomes too high of using these vendors. That's why it's so important to monitor vendors on a regular basis. In addition, your customers are going to expect you to be doing this. If you're using a vendor and there's a breach at the vendor, that doesn't mean that it's not your responsibility to notify your customers. Your customers are expecting you to notify them. Your customers are expecting you to use vendors that are reliable and trustworthy. So if you have a breach at a vendor, it could be a reflection on you for using that vendor. So it's very important to monitor your vendors on a regular basis.